she come across this Bigfoot, and they stood face to face for a while.
That changed my whole life, really, at that moment. My conclusions that I immediately drew was that this is not a human being. Okay? Second thing was, it was speaking a language, which was way beyond anything that I could imagine. And the third thing was, it could not be fake. It was not fake.
So does Bigfoot actually have a language? Well, Scott Nelson, a cryptolinguist, really thinks he has found on those Sierra Bigfoot tapes a language spoken by Bigfoot. We're headed out for a Bigfoot research trip, but first we've got to have a little fun along the way. So we have found the perfect attire for our interview that we're going to be doing a little bit later. You know, we're on a serious research trip, but this just was precious. A precious synchronistic find. So this lady in the store, we just went in the store, and this lady had a story about a Bigfoot, that she heard something one night. And how did she describe what it sounded like, Mary?
She said it scared her, that it was, I don't know, I don't remember.
Well, she said it sounded like something that she had never heard before.
Right.
And it really terrified her. And there's some Boy Scout camp around here that there are a lot of stories about that same thing. So maybe we can check that out after we do our interview.
Right. What did they call it?
Momo. It's Momo. Missouri Monster, I think. Some antique shopping and this guy. He was right next door to our little rental house where we met up with Scott Nelson, the expert on the language of Bigfoot.
And this out. I need it. Yes. I originally grew up in the Rocky Mountains, pretty heavy Bigfoot country, but I was never into that. I had a lot of friends that believed in Bigfoot, and they called him all kinds of different things. You know, each Indian tribe or nation has a different name for the Sasquatch. I joined the Navy early. I have a BA degree in literature and communications. I'm one of the few two-time graduates of the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center in Monterey, California. After that, 20 years of cryptologic technician interpreter, which that deals with the collection of voice communications, then the transcription, then the analysis, and then the reporting of the intelligence that we gather from the collection. I believe that one of my most important qualifications is the hundreds into the thousands of hours of listening to the human voice on tape. I had my son with me at school. And one day I was teaching at Wentworth Military College, so I had brought him to school with me. He was 12 years old at the time, and he had a project that he had to work on for school. He had to write a paper on UFOs, the Loch Ness Monster, or Bigfoot. Which of those three do you want to write on? He says, okay, let's write it on Bigfoot. So I said, okay, let's Google Bigfoot. And he says, Dad, what do you think Bigfoots sound like? And I remembered some B-grade movie from the 70s, and I just let out this howl, and I think they sound like, you know. And he goes, Dad, come on. That's not what Bigfoot sound like. I said, well, let's Google it. So we did. And the first place it took us to was the BFRO website, which I didn't know existed at the time. That's Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. And it had a little prompt there, Bigfoot sounds. Literally, Bigfoot sounds. So I punched on that, and it brought up the strangest sounds I had ever heard. It gave me little snippets of the Sierra sounds, just little snippets. But in those little snippets, what we linguists would call a morpheme stream, or a sentence, or an utterance, right? I heard something that I didn't believe at first, right? And so I played a little bit more, I played a little bit more, and I was so totally focused on it because I was amazed at what I was hearing. That my son said, "Dad, what's the matter?" I said, "Listen to this." And I went back and I played it again. And I went back and I played it again. And he said, "Dad, what are you talking about?" He said, "That sounds like apes fighting." I said, "Son, there is language in here." The reason that I'm recognizing this is because all of my years of manipulating the human voice on tape, speeding it up and slowing it down to try to recover the phonemes or the sounds of languages that are not even my target language. We're required to know how to do that. I left that school that day with Stephen, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. But it set me on a quest, if you will, a little detective work to find out where these tapes came from. I approached the BFRO, where you got them, and I got a call from the head of the BFRO, right? Pretty famous guy now, but he told me, he says, "Don't go there." And this guy was very honest. We're still acquaintances and friends, you know. And I completely understand and understood at that time where he was coming from. He said on that phone call, he called me, right? Because I'd sent them a big email as to what I had. And I was just trying to find the tapes. He called me and we had a good conversation. He says, "Scott, if you go there, it will throw a big wrench in what we're trying to do." He said, "We're in the middle of a big battle right now. Struggle against science and everything, all the institutions, right? Just to try to prove their existence, or to get science to accept the fact that just even the possibility that they exist." He says, "If you come out with this now, it'll throw a wrench into everything we've tried to do for years and years." I got another call from a person in the BFRO that was interested in what I had. And she, I owe her a lot for this, because otherwise I never would have gotten involved. She went out on a limb and called me and told me that the person that I need to get a hold of is Ron Moorhead. And that's the person I had to call. And that's all she said. And that was enough. So I made a few phone calls, and I finally found his office, talked to his secretary, left my name and number, never got a call back. So he wasn't returning calls. But I called back again, and he happened to pick up the phone. And I spent probably a half an hour on the phone with him, convincing him that I was legitimate. Finally, he agreed, and within 2 days I had 2 CDs. I began to transcribe them according to military standards. And it took me 4 months. The two different tapes. One was recorded by Al Berry in 1972 up at the top of the Sierra Mountains in what they call the Sierra Camp. And the other tape was what I call the Moorhead tape, was recorded by Ron Moorhead in 1974. So they were spaced out by 2 years, but both recorded at the same place. Some difference. I believe that they were the same creatures or the same family unit, but they were different in that. In Ron's tape, I believe they were trying to slow their utterances down to try to communicate with the humans. They were trying to actually, of course they couldn't, because their language is so different. But I believe that they were trying to slow the prosody of the deliverance down. No, 72 tape, the delivery of the utterances was at least twice as fast as that of humans by the Sasquatches. If these creatures are actually Sasquatches, you know, I can't say what they are. All I know is that whatever it is, it's not a human being, and they're speaking a complex language. From that point, it took me 4 months to transcribe all of them because there's over 90 minutes of it. And as you'll see in my when I demonstrate my methodology, which all comes from my training in the Navy, it takes 15 minutes or a half an hour to get a little 3 or 4 second clip to get it down correctly. So it took me about 4 months. Once I had them done, I drove out to California to meet face to face with Ron and Al. I drove out to California to meet Ron and Al personally. And one of the first things I said to them is, I cannot believe that I am the first person to detect language in these sounds. And it had been 35 years. By that time I had read all of the Bigfoot books, including a new book that had just come out at the time, Sasquatch Meets Science, very, very good book, written by Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who's big in the research community. Not in any of these books was there ever one hint that these creatures might have a language. And so I brought that up to Ron and Al. I says, I don't believe that I could be the only person ever, the first person ever to have discovered this. And they looked at each other and they looked at me and says, Scott, we always knew. Especially Ron, because Al remained a skeptic for a long time. But they said, yes, we always knew that they were speaking a language to each other. He knew there was more than one. In Al's tape and in Ron's tape, has to be a massive male because of the resonance and just, the feel. You can almost feel the power of their utterance. And then there's a female. Obviously, and coming from two different parts of the forest. They're not together. So besides the fact that one actually sounds like a female and the other one definitely sounds like a huge, gigantic male, and they're exchanging utterances. There's query. There's a query response, and then there's a statement response. It's the only way you can put it. So that's what they said. They understood. Yeah. This is what what we call the Berry tape. Alan Berry was a journalist, and he was not a part of this group of hunters that had been using this camp going back into the late 50s, early 60s. So they knew something was up there. So Alan, as a journalist and a scientist, decided to take up a big reel-to-reel tape recorder. They placed it all out at the camp and placed the microphone where they thought would be a good spot if they had any interaction. They also had put a big pot of stew on the camp stove to try to draw them in, to try to draw the creatures in. They referred to the creatures as Biggie. What you'll hear is the interaction between a large male, and the reason I say large is because it could not be a juvenile. It has to come from my professional experience, it has to come from a set of lungs that is much, much bigger than a human's, with what we would call the resonance of it alone. And then there's a female, and you will hear that it actually sounds like a female. The same difference that humans have. And then there is that this tape actually all starts out with a couple of whimpers or whistles or squeaks by a juvenile or even a child. And the three of them, throughout this first part that I will play for you, continue to interact with each other. And as we go along through this, I will point those out to you. I'd like to play a good cut of it first at real time, which is the speed at which it was recorded. And then I go back and pick specific parts of it to show you how I slow it down. Now that's obviously the juvenile who starts the whole conversation. The female. That's the female. It's also the female. You will be able to hear the difference. There. That was an exchange between the two. Befawadi, Befalulu. Even at real time, you can begin to hear the exchanges, what we call conversational turns. In other words, I take a turn to speak to you, and then you take a turn to speak back to me. So an exchange of utterance or conversational turns, and you'll also begin to hear in the background one of the cowboys, one of the hunters up there, who is trying to get the attention of the creatures. Once this starts happening, they send a guy out to stand by the big pot of stew and try to get their attention. Hey, come on down, you will hear it. Come on down and get some dinner. One of the reasons that we know, that I knew immediately that this could not be fake, is that you will hear the hunter and the creatures speaking at the same time, stepping on each other's voice. It cannot be faked, and it certainly could not be faked in 1972. Play this at real time. They are making, by the way, they are making sounds that humans can't make. That's a special. Once you are clued in that this is a language, your mind is ready to accept the fact that these creatures are speaking a language. You can begin to hear it. You can begin, even at real time, to hear their language. That's real time. When I slow it down, it will become very apparent. It even begins to sound human. How do we know it's not a human and you've just speeded the tapes up? Well, no. You will hear the difference. Because humans can't make this. This does not sound like a human's voice speeded up. We all have heard human voices speeded up. Even very fast. It sounds like the chipmunks. This does not sound like the chipmunks. Humans who had been in the little lean-to cabin that they had up there started to come out, and in their mind they were speaking in the cabin, we need to get out there and make sure we're capturing this, because they were all freaked out by it. When they come out, the big male eventually becomes aggressive. We'll call that a snarl. I want to show you the difference between the vocal footprint of the humans and the vocal footprint of the creatures. If you can see this.
Come on, Biggie. Come on now. Come on, boy.
This is the guy that was standing by the big pot of stew. Now, I personally would not have liked to have been the guy that was selected to be the decoy. Standing by the food going, come on down, Biggie. Come down and get some dinner. And they did that in order to distract the creatures from the guys that were moving the microphone up closer.
Okay, Biggie, here comes some dinner.
You hear them begin to walk.
Where'd they sound like they were coming from?
Where did it sound
Which
like?
direction?
Which direction? Where did it sound like it's coming from? A little bit further up that way. You can hear the distance increasing between them and the guy at the food pot.
Yeah. Yeah.
This about right, Al? They didn't know how massive and resonant the sounds were. You can see the sound footprint of the footsteps and how different the human voice footprint is from the Sasquatch footprint of the creature. Now here is when he begins to get really aggressive, and he kind of builds himself up into a rage, because what happened with the humans, they don't go immediately back into the cabin, into the lean-to. Big male begins to get aggressive. Probably in an attempt to, just like a human would, try to scare, intimidate. Now here, you see the humans and the creatures stepping on each other. You're the humans. They're not going back in yet, which really makes him mad. Here we go. female. The male. That's obviously the male and the female having conversational terms. Because he becomes so aggressive that she comes in and it's almost like she's saying, hey, she calms him down, apparently. Yeah, because he slowly composes himself and then they move on, right? And I like to joke, in some of my presentations that it sounds like an old married couple, having a little argument there. That's the first big interaction between them and humans and between themselves. There's a reason that they're able to speak that fast. And it's also one of the reasons why we know that it's not a human. Okay? And that is because they articulate on the pant. I'm telling you this now so that you might be able to hear it. Okay? Speaking on the pant means the inhale. Humans, we're able to do it, but it's very difficult for us. Okay? In other words, we can go, I want, no, when. We can do it, but it's extremely difficult for humans. These creatures do it with ease. As you can see, I've isolated this little 1 second little clip. The phonemes, phoneme is a single sound. A morpheme is what we would call a syllable. We can't speak in terms of words. We have to use, linguistic terms, which would be a syllable, a phoneme, a single sound, or a morpheme stream, which is a complete utterance of what we might call a sentence. I've isolated this, I've put it on a loop. Okay, now you can hear it much easier once I've slowed it down. Now let me put it back at 100%. Slow it down again. Even at real time, you can begin to hear, once your mind is open to the fact that this is a language you're hearing. Now, in this particular little clip, you can also hear what we would call in human language a terminal expression. Many human languages have it. Chinese, for instance, once you speak a sentence or an utterance, they end with articulation that means I'm done speaking. It's almost like CB radio. These creatures do is they'll say the utterance, so we've called this a terminal expression or a terminal utterance. When they're done speaking, that kind of gives the other person the clue to, hey, it's your turn. And you'll hear this throughout. They'll also have what I call a terminal snarl. They'll go, and sometimes it stands alone. I've heard this out in the woods myself 12 times in different places, from Missouri to the top of the Sierras. I've called it a concession snarl because it seems to come when you're out, and you'll hear it here, when you're out in the woods and you're trying to talk to them, and it's like they're just trying to be nice and give you something. Yeah, you never see them, but you hear this come from the woods. My son has heard it, and you'll hear, but it's so deep and low, and there's no other creature that does that. And again, that's on the pant. you've got an exhale, and then you've got a pant snarl. Like this, right? This is not human. Oh. You know what? Robot touch. This is Befawandi, Befalulu. I'm gonna play this whole snippet here, and even at real time, I believe you'll be able to hear that it sounds like, and I like to joke about this in my presentation, is it sounds like the big male is telling a joke, and then he laughs at his own joke. Yuck. It becomes comical. And by the way, these are things that a cryptolinguist are trained to do. We're trained to open our mind, not dealing with stuff like this, but even with humans. When we're sitting the cans and we're collecting or we're transcribing something, and we're trained to transcribe languages that are not our own language, that are not our target language. So we're trained in recovery of the sounds, no matter what language it is. Okay? So it fits right in with what we're doing here, where they articulate. I've isolated 36 different phonemes. But these creatures are articulating with it, and exactly the same apparatus that we have. The same tracheal tree, the vocal cavity with the tongue, the teeth, the lips. We know that the lesser apes cannot do it because they don't have the apparatus. I usually like to give you my arguments for the 3 conclusions that I came to that day in my classroom. Again, those conclusions are, this is not a human being. Number 2, they are speaking a language, a complex language. And 3, that it could not have been faked. I immediately knew that it was not a human. Beyond my professional experience, the vocal range that the creatures speak at, both above and below the ability of humans to articulate those sounds. When I first drew that conclusion on that day, I didn't know that Ron and Al had already submitted the tapes to a Dr. Kerman, studied these tapes. Now, he's not a linguist. He's a sound specialist. He analyzed these tapes, came to the conclusion that these creatures are speaking in frequencies, if you will, and I'm not a sound guy, so I don't know all of their terminology, but in frequencies way above the human ability and way below. And there might even be some indication that it goes beyond both above and below our ability to hear. So we've got the corroboration of Dr. Curlin. For me, almost immediately were a couple things. The resonance, for one. The booming sound of these creatures was coming from something, from my professional experience, was way bigger than any human that I'd ever heard in my life. And then there was the speed of delivery, or the prosody, what we say, of delivery of the utterances. So fast that we can say that it's pretty close to twice as fast as the ability for humans to even speak. Even when we're agitated, right, or anxious and want to get something out quickly, it's very, very difficult for us to speak that fast. And here's why, is that these creatures speak or utter or articulate on the pant, which humans are unable to do. Now that's something it took me a couple of years to figure out. What was it they were doing? So that was not one of the issues immediately when I made that first conclusion. That's something that I had that came to me over time. after listening and listening and listening to it and analyzing it. And it was like one of those aha moments. I came to realize, oh my gosh, that's why they're so fast. They are speaking on the exhale and also on the inhale, or on the pant, which is, it's not impossible for humans to do, but it's almost impossible. And it's definitely impossible for us to do it the way they do it. Therefore, it's not human. Whatever they are. Not human by our definition of human. Second thing, they're speaking a language. In 2012, I authored a paper, The Characteristics of Human Language Evident in the Barry Moorhead Tapes. And I essentially took all of those characteristics that Brown University claimed were the definition of human language. And I went down piece by piece, those characteristics that we hear in these tapes that fit right into those by which we define human language. Things like conversational terms, where one creature speaks and the other creature takes a turn and speaks back. Things like the repeat of morphemes, both by the same creature, repeating the same morpheme or morpheme stream, one creature uttering a morpheme stream, and then it is repeated back to the other person or creature by the other one, the other individual. We have query inflection in these tapes. In other words, one of the creatures actually makes it sound like a question inflection. It actually goes up and in, just like humans do. The difference for us between a question and a statement is, it is hot outside, compared to, it is hot outside. You actually hear this different inflection in their language. Sometimes in the same utterance where it repeats the morpheme stream. In other words, hot outside. Is it hot outside? Yes, it's hot outside. Then there's the expression of emotion, what is obviously anxiety. In the Moorhead tape, we actually have an expression of pleasure. We have an expression that I played for you, where one individual actually sounds like he is laughing. We have all of the functions of language by which we define human language. We see it in these tapes. So there is no question that it is indeed a language. How do you know that it's not mimicry? Evident in these tapes, we do have some mimicry, but it's most often the humans trying to mimic the creatures, not the other way around. How did I know immediately that it was not fake? As a Russian cryptolinguist, I was trained long ago in all of the deceptive practices of the Russians, all of the deceptive communication practices of the Russians. Okay, and they tried. That Russians at that time, they were the best at it. And we're talking at that time in the 80s, long after this. Yeah, the Russians were able to do some crazy stuff with manipulation and this or that to try to fool us as collectors. Even the Russians could not have faked this. And certainly not in 1972 and 1974. That, I think, was the first clue to me immediately that this could not be faked. But there were other telltale signs. The fact that the humans and the creatures are stepping on each other. As we say in the collection business, there's two speakers stepping over each other. For instance, with the creatures themselves stepping on each other. As if, like, I like to use the example of a married couple. Because this is obviously a male and a female, and they're stepping on each other. It's like a married couple, and you anticipate what the other person is asking, and you answer their question before they finish the sentence. That's one of the things I knew. These tapes could not have been faked. They didn't have the telltale signs, and apparently there are quite a few that would have had to have shown up in order for that to have been faked. Those are my arguments as to those three conclusions that I came to. Again, it's not a human, they're speaking a language, and it's not fake.